Okay, this podcast slash video is about one of my favorite topics. At the moment, this topic is really lighting up a lot of workshops I'm doing, and people are having sort of pleasantly shocked responses to it. It makes sense of a lot of things that are going on in the world. In some ways, it's kind of like we could say like a red pill. It's not the easiest listening at times, it's not the easiest thing to face, but well worth it, in my opinion. So, my latest obsession, decadence. Notice just kind of what happens to you in that word. Some people have a kind of almost repulsive response to it. Like they don't want to go there. It's actually quite taboo. Other people, it's more like a sort of chocolate brand or, something like that. Something kind of fun and a bit naughty, but actually fun. I would suggest there are other responses to it than that. But just notice your kind of first response to it. People don't know this. Many people probably don't know this. One of my main hobbies is history. I love studying history. I've been a history geek for quite a long time. It's one of the main things I sort of learn about in my spare time. Since I was a kid, I'm into it. And history, one way of looking at it is a sort of a progress, very Western way of looking at it, actually, going from A to B. Another way of looking at it is it's more cyclical. So you'll see that in many cultures, many South American cultures, Indian culture. I think even the ancient Greeks had that actually at one point. And that makes us look at things quite differently. Also, when you study history, you do see patterns. There are patterns that occur again and again and again. And one of these patterns is that civilizations tend to rise and fall. Even the idea that we're in a civilization might seem strange. The Romans maybe didn't think of themselves as Romans. They just thought this is where we're at. Incas just said this is it. So Western civilization, the dominant force, now you could cut that different ways. Some people include all of Europe, some people just Western Europe. Some people actually more talk about American civilization, US-led civilization taking over from, of course, Anglo civilization, the British Empire before that. So while this complicates things and there's different ways of cutting it, I think there'd be no doubt so that Western civilization has been dominant in the world for quite a long time. Of course, there are different parts to that. And it's a very interesting civilization. It's actually generally regarded as an extreme civilization if we were to compare civilizations on different scales. Often people in the West either don't think they're in a civilization, it's not something that just occurs to them, or they have quite a negative view of it. So a few times I've sort of said, hey, to my friends, when you think of Western civilization, they come back with the Gandhi quip. Gandhi, of course, who would have been killed by almost any other empire, rather than, his statue put in London outside the Houses of Parliament, and, I think in many ways rightly regarded as a hero. People are often just seeing the negative side. Western civilization has a particular trend to be sort of self-critical. This is part of its strength, but also perhaps a weakness. So when one looks at civilizations, Western, other, one sees that they go through cycles of rising and falling. And there's quite set patterns for this. It's not random. There are people who've devoted their entire careers as historians, really for a couple of hundred years, actually for quite a while, looking at this and seeing the cycles that tend to happen. So one you may have heard of, it's a very sort of simplified one, is hard times. I'm going to degender this because I don't think it's not about men, but I think it should be about people. So hard times create strong people. Strong people create good times. Good times create weak people. Weak people create bad times. Now, if you just try on for a moment, there might be some truth in that. And certainly seems to be, it's more complex than that, but looking at history, different civilizations, I'm going to give many examples in this, many examples from all over the world. Not just the Romans, who are the kind of famous ones. We're going to talk about the Aztecs, we're going to talk about the Egyptians, we can talk about the Chinese, we can talk about all sorts. Where are we at in that cycle? Where would you say we're at? Well, we've certainly had some sort of unprecedented good times in many ways, right? Now, even though life can be difficult, certainly Western medicine's amazing. There's been the Great Peace since World War II. If we think of sort of what we have access to, we're in what Buddhists would call fortunate conditions. We're generally not starving. I may talk about Ukraine later, but we're generally not at war. We don't have to worry about horsemen coming across, or Viking, raiders coming across. While we may have had the Chinese plague, we don't have sort of apocalyptic viruses, the Black Death, things like that. We seem to have gone through a sort of good patch. Some people, by the way, say that good period peaked in 1950, roughly after World War II. Some people say much earlier than that. Some people say a bit later. Nobody I've spoken to about this, and so if I just reflect on it, would say that we've not yet reached the peak, or we're in the peak even. So reflect for a moment, consider, try on that we might be in a period of sort of fall of empire, fall of civilization, and the term that's usually used for that, or one term, is decadence. Decadence. So there's certain features that crop up again and again and again, whether we're talking about the ancient Chinese or the Romans or the Byzantiums or the Ottomans. It doesn't really matter what color people are, what language they speak. We see these same features again and again and again as the civilization gets weaker. So we mentioned sort of strength, the idea of ruggedness, and that's physical, but also mental, emotional, many kind of other kinds of it. It tends to move from the physical to other domains. And that movement, could be a sort of when people go from sort of have to be physically strong and, conquering, to sort of more intellectually strong and new ideas and new creations. And, the British Empire, for example, doing all sorts of great inventions and new things. However, strength and achievement is still part of it. Still sort of rugged, still kind of outward focused, expanding. And at a certain point, it stops expanding. That might be in some ways again a good thing, but it starts looking in. Eventually builds walls around itself, literally and figuratively. The Great Wall of China, whether that be, or, sort of Trump's thing, build a wall, many versions of this. And it also, there's very specific features that happen. When you read books on this, it's actually kind of scary, because some of them are things like celebrity chefs become a thing. The Romans had celebrity chefs. They also had overpaid sports people. They were charioteers, not footballers, however. And there's more, but these are very, very specific things. Sex tends to be an obsession. Traditional gender roles break down. Again, you might say that again is a good thing in many ways. It's just what I'm really putting here is the signs of sort of late stage of civilization. Gender becomes very fluid. Also, it might be the sort of there's a lack of meaning. There's a sort of, we could say, nihilism. Often comes to that. It's just, well, if nothing really matters and I'm the center of the world, narcissism, and I might as well just have a good time, hedonism. So if we look at, say, the Weimar Republic, which was Germany after World War I, we see many of these sort of decadent features. Equally in sort of Chinese empires of various periods before the Mongols invaded or whatever, very similar things. Often beauty kind of deteriorates as well, and the morality is more established, we say, like etiquette, usually linguistically or just through appearance. So let's take, I don't know, the Sun King. Was it Louis XVI, I think it was? So this was before the revolution in France. The French Empire became very, very decadent. Food obsession, the banquets, the sex obsession was there. And also, you have to have the right amount of lace on your collar, and you had to have the right kind of earring and dance in a certain particular way. And if you did offend the king, then you were cancelled. I mean, you were guillotined, yeah? Also, cities change, the nature of work changes. There might be large amounts of immigration from people from outside the empire. So, for example, I read an account of Rome not long ago, which was talking about Gauls and Germanic people in Rome with their different gods and their different ways of doing things. And critically, their sort of lack of commitment to a Roman ethos, a Roman value set. So the sort of coherence of a society's values disintegrates on the inside, both because there's just people there who don't believe in it, right? If you go to London or Paris, or many places, you'll see this. People have different value sets, and again, there's some positives to this. I like a curry as much as the next man. However, that's very different than everyone having a coherent set of beliefs, set of rituals, set of things to get behind. I've been in Ukraine, for example, last year, and you'll see there was a re-emergence very strongly of we are Ukrainian, and we believe in this, and we're going to be Western, not Russian. They actually had a choice. Unlike many of us in the West who don't necessarily know there's a choice, or don't necessarily think of ourselves as having a choice of civilizations, they very clearly did, actually voted for a choice, and it wasn't a CIA plot. They just looked at Russian civilization, which sometimes included in the West, but only just sometimes looked at very differently. And they went, we don't want to be part of this. We don't want the corruption. We don't want the dictatorship. We don't want this way of life. We want a Western democracy. We want a Western economic system. We want a Western cultural system, things like gay rights, women's rights, things that they believed in. So the Ukrainians just looked, look left and look right, like almost literally, and went, this looks better. You know, they had friends in Poland who were doing pretty well since the fall of communism, and they had family in Russia. It's very common to have friends and family in both places. My wife does. And to then go, okay, that looks better. Let's go for that. So that choice of civilization was very clear to them. And also the coherence once the war started, or this version of the war, this latest part of the war. Wearing a Ukrainian t-shirt for those who can't see face, was given to me by a refugee friend. When the war started, they got even more into Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian values, coherence around that. And that would have been very difficult had they been a culture with many, you know, of course there are some different religions, some different ethnicities within Ukraine, but nowhere near, say, that of Paris. Though perhaps more than, say, Japan, which I think would be another example of a place that's kept a lot of its civilization, despite being nuclear bombed and various other things, that it's got a coherence to it. Shared values, very, very important. Anyway, so where was I? So there's these signs that civilizations are ending, and the more you look at them, I could list up 10 more, but the more you look at them, the more you go, wow, it looks like we're in this period. And I've laid this out to various people now, and it's kind of hard to argue with. It's when you're watching Sam Smith and doing some awards, or you're watching Eurovision, I think was the latest one I saw, you see this decadence, and it's logical. You can analyze it and say, oh, there's this symptoms, you know, there's this sign. Or you can actually, it's just a felt sense as well. It's, think of it as a sort of conservative moral impulse, which we all have to some degree to conserve, is felt, and it's often a sort of disgust. It's often a disgust. So a note for later to say something. That disgust actually can be very dangerous in terms of a swing back. I'll come to that. Great. So it's often a feeling of disgust or sort of decadence, or just a feeling of like, this has gone too far. I think many people have been experiencing that with some of the more extremes of the intersectionality world, of just going, you know what, I'm for gay marriage, I'm kind of liberal, you know, whatever, 2 consenting adults want to go, but his stuff is going a bit crazy. And there's a madness to it. There's a decadent civilization that's have an insanity to it. The fall of Rome was made worse by lead piping, of course, but the lack of coherence of values, the increase of subjective and intersubjective as the measure. So as I identify as this, it's subjective, right? And of course there's truth in that, there's beauty in that, but to just have the subjective, to say, you know, truth is whatever I say it was. You hear people say now, my truth. Effectively, the good, the true, and the beautiful all get broken down by decadence. So what is good, people become nihilistic. They say there's no good, no bad, which of course is unlivable because we have to choose what to do. You know, if I kill a baby, you're going to go, that's horrible. You know, we have to choose not to do that. We need to know what to do in the morning. We have options, we have decisions. So you have to have values. You can't even see actually without values, let alone act. So it's crazy making when there's no way to be good. I know my trigonometry podcast didn't long ago. So look, it's very difficult for people now because there isn't a clear way to be good. You know, in the past it was be a good Christian, or be a good Englishman, or a good Frenchman, or whatever. Now, not so much. So what you're left with, these kind of language games, which are usually sort of run by kind of new elite priesthood, and they're constantly changing, and, you know, things that seem quite subtly different, like people of color versus colored people. I don't have a strong opinion on that one, but it's pretty similar. It's just the same words in a different order. And it can be kind of crazy making. Everything can feel kind of like a minefield. You know, imagine you're in Louis XVI's court and you have the wrong number of ruffles on your top, and all of a sudden you're being killed. The kind of crazy making nature of it, also because of the lack of the clear good, what it means to be a good Greek citizen, or a great, you know, good member of the Egyptian Empire, or a great, you know, good Orthodox Jew, or whatever it is. When that's missing, how do you act? You don't have a sense of purpose, yeah? And what you're really left with is just, well, I'll just have a good time. Hedonism, something like 3 horsemen again, something saying nihilism, narcissism, and hedonism. The narcissism is, well, if no one else is, if there's no other God, I'm God. And it's like the hedonism is, well, let's just distract ourselves from the lack of meaning. It's almost like a self-medication. Distract ourselves with the lack of meaning by throwing oneself into more carnal desires. So, you know, usually it's food, sex, this kind of thing. The obsession with the body. So rather than be healthy, be virile, it becomes be a bodybuilder, or starve yourself, look like a model. And the beautiful is also wrecked. So for some reason I think of lip filler when I think of this. The sort of grotesque side of beauty. It might be Chinese foot binding in a certain late periods of Chinese empires. or, you know, very, very extreme kind of practices, which are kind of grotesque and not really just about sort of health and vitality and well-being, which is the main basis of beauty I would say in a healthy culture. You know, just for me, for example, just a healthy, relatively athletic, relatively childbearing looking, healthy, well woman is attractive to me. Okay, and I would say this is pretty universal. I remember being in Ethiopia with my friend Tessify, and we agreed who was the healthiest, who was the most attractive woman at the dance in Hawassa in Ethiopia. And it was, you know, the person was relatively symmetrical, looking very healthy, looking bright eyes, you know. He might have had some cultural stuff that I didn't have. Her hair was a certain way, or certain bracelets or whatever that he was into. But we both pretty much agreed, like, that's beauty. She's beautiful. And yeah, there is a universality to some degree to beauty, because this isn't just culturally constructed. So beauty tends to go down. Another example of this, I would ask you, if you think this is not the case, when was the most beautiful building in your town built? So I live in a small English town. The most ugly building is the relatively recent shopping centre. And the most attractive building, I'd say, is probably the church, which is maybe 17th century. You could make a case for some of the more sort of noble, kind of government type buildings, maybe 19th century. 20th century, sort of okay. There's a few cottages that are quite nice. You know, there's a few cool eco houses from modern times that are sort of cool, but they're not really beautiful. And most of the modern buildings there are just disgusting. And the sort of architecture, I think, shows this. I'm actually recording this in Barcelona's hotel room in Barcelona. I'm recording this, and there's so much beautiful architecture in Barcelona. And it's actually relatively recent for a Western civilization, and plus the really old stuff as well. The old churches from the Spanish Empire, you know, before the British and the French. Still part of that Western tradition, if we break it down that way. I mean, just stunning. And I sat in the Palace of Catalan Musical Culture, I think the Gaudi building. I just sat there for 40, 50 minutes absorbing the beauty, just like, wow. And then sadly, there's people around me taking selfies and doing all this. And I just wanted to sit there and absorb it. I think the other thing to say here is that decadence really goes down everyone's heart. Like, I don't want to sound like the sort of crazy conservative guy who's like, you know, it's all those kids today. And people have always said this to some degree as they get older, right? So we might want to factor that in. And if this has been going on for a while, that wouldn't actually go against this argument, right? Because we would see more decadence with time if the process of decline takes 100-200 years, as it usually does in empires. But, like, what was I saying? Yeah, not being like super conservative and saying like, you know, this is just this kids today. I think we could actually point to some of these things and say, there's mental health issues, there's drug addiction issues. Like, despite having quite a lot of affluence still, or it has gone down a little bit now, people are crazy. Just the levels of mental ill health in the UK and the US, for example, I don't know what France or Germany is like, but the UK is absolutely sky high. I walk down the street in any English town, I just see a level of drug addiction and mental ill health I've never seen before, not in my lifetime. Child suicide is a thing. You know, shooting up schools is a thing. I mean, how many of these signs do we need before we say mental health is not good? Mental health is not good. Morality has declined. And even the word morality can sound sort of old-fashioned, can sound kind of like, you know, some fuddy-duddy kind of guy. A big symptom, I'd say cynicism. You see a sort of, it always reminds you of Berlin, which is always kind of a decadent city, actually, from the Weimar Republic on. Cynicism, you know, the hipster vibe, too cool for school. We don't really talk about being virtuous anymore. It just sounds like some Greek fantasy, you know, Socrates, or how do we be virtuous? No one's interested in virtue anymore. They're too busy being cool, right? We've replaced virtue. Like, what is the good anymore? And it's not just the good that's broken, the true's broken. Like, no one trusts anything anymore. We don't trust institutions, another sign of breakdown. We don't trust the religious institutions, the government institutions, we don't trust science, the meaning and sense-making institutions. You know, it's just the media. No one trusts anyone anymore. There's a breakdown in basic trust. And the idea of, well, what is true? It feels very relative, you know, hence the whole my truth thing. So beauty, absolutely going down the pan, no doubt about it, particularly, you know, often it's sort of higher beauty things become bread and circuses. You know, the Colosseum was entertainment as opposed to art. Where is culture? Talking about Western culture now. Who's producing Western culture? When was the last time you saw an original movie or music even that you thought was original? It seems like culture's just died. It's just a recycling of nonsense now. I think on top of this, we've also got something that's maybe unique in this decadence, which is tech. So there's always been bread and circuses, but now those circuses are in our hands, optimized to our addictive tendencies. From a Buddhist point of view, which is something I've studied in some detail, we could look at decadence as sort of being when greed, ignorance, and delusion take over. Greed, ignorance, and hatred take over. So we're constantly being put in this fight or flight state. And the technology is deliberately doing that. It's optimized for that, for profit. We are optimized by consumerism and advertising and the tech again for greed, for give me more attention. So the narcissism is optimized. And there are studies on this actually showing the increasing narcissism. There are actually ratings of that and ways it goes up and down. And I think this is not an insignificant part of our decadence. You know, let's take pornography. Pornography has always been part of decadence to some degree. Again, Weimar Republic, even Rome, you know, etchings and shit. But the tech deluge of that kind of super dopamine signal to us, the news constantly, fight or flight, the distraction constantly, this runs right down the middle of us, right? So I don't want to, sorry, I lost my train of thought earlier. This is what I wanted to say earlier, that I know when I'm doing something decadent. I know when I'm eating just ridiculous amounts of food or sugary food, but it just doesn't, it's more than I need to actually nourish myself. It's beyond enjoying a good meal. I know when my sexual activity is decadent, and I have done this experiment. I've done the hedonism experiment. You know, I lived above a nightclub in Brazil. I have had sex with a lot of people over the years, and I'm not proud of that. I'm not saying that as a boast. Please don't hear it as a boast. I'm lucky not to have had loads of STIs. I'm lucky to have, you know, not got into serious trouble with it. And it's, that's decadent. I feel that now. There's a yuck. You know, there's a yuck when I look at my body count, as the kids say, that body. Kids, by the way, turning a bit more conservative when it comes to this. Yeah, there's a yuck factor. If I look at porn, I don't do very often, but I look at it, I go, there's something in me that feels grubby. There's something in me that knows this isn't good for me. You know, on a spiritual level, of course, what's really missing in decadence is connection, right? Self-connection, connection with nature, connection with others. My whole career has been about connection. And I notice when I'm really connected to myself, to my values, to my community, to spirit, to, you know, to nature, I don't want to eat junk food or look at porn. You know, I don't want to do anything decadent. And what I'm noticing is the more I look at this topic, the more it becomes clear to me how I want to live. Try this on. Just try it on for a day or for a week or a month, whatever you want to commit to. Commitment, there's another thing with decadence. Try it on. And you go, does this make my behavior better or worse? Better for what? Better by your own values, not mine. Better by your own health. Better by your own relationships. Better for your work. Whatever matters to you. Don't take my values here. Take your own. Yeah, does it make, for me, it just leans me into more positive behavior. It leads me into being more honest. It leads me into being healthier. It leads me into treating people better. It makes me more productive, etc., etc., etc. So, how does it end? Okay, so bad news time. There's good news coming, I promise. For about 10 minutes time. So it usually ends with implosion, invasion, or conservative swing back. So what does that look like? So invasion could be from outside. The barbarians come in. You know, the stronger empire invades. And given that the strongest empire other than the West right now is China, that has organ harvesting and concentration camps and social credit scores, and it's just a nightmare. Like if you think you don't love Western civilization, put it side by side with China, and then come back and apologize to your spiritual father, which is the West. You know, I don't want Chinese civilization to be dominant. There's certainly a lot I would like improved in American and British foreign policy and our civilization in general. But side by side, China, really? I mean, it's probably not going to be Russia now because they're getting bankrupted by the war. They're the other major alternative. India, if we're lucky, they still at least have a spiritual core. Maybe Brazil, but probably not. India, if we're lucky, could take over. But more, there's this sort of big one waiting in the wings, and probably going to be the most powerful empires in 50 years is China. And they look at our decadence, and they have words for it, you know. what is it they call it? It's a Chinese, a Mandarin word, which is to do with sort of what we would call diversity or inclusion. They're just laughing at it. They just think it's hilarious. And you see the sort of weakening of the education system. You know, their kids are all studying sciences and maths and learning to be computer programmers. They're not doing sociology degrees. They just think it's ridiculous and bizarre and decadent, and they're right, you know, and they're actually taking measures to stop, for example, the feminization of young men in China. That's part of decadence as well. So, yeah, that is who could take over. And to me, that's a horrifying thought. So invasion from abroad. Implosion. So just implosion, decadence just gets ridiculous. It's for those that know Warhammer 40k, this is a Slaanesh taking over the Elder Empire. This is just the sort of murder fucking goes too far. Things get absolutely ridiculous, and normally combined with some sort of internal tension with immigrant populations that have different values. So this kind of implosion. The other way you can go is sort of swing to the far right, and this obviously after the Weimar Republic came the Nazis. So this is not good. In case anyone thinks I'm making a case for this is not good. There's been examples of this I think in Judaism as well, like religious groups taking over in Islam, very religious groups taking over. And it's this extreme swing to the conservative because it just goes too far, and people, you know, get tired of the absolute madness and the nonsense and the ugliness, and they just go, come on, we need to pay the bills, we need to farm the land, we need to, the land base being destroyed. That's another one about decadence. And again, Incas and other empires have done it, not just the West. The land base meaning farmland, the ability for the culture to produce its own food. This has happened in Carthage, I believe, as well. If I remember that bit of history right. Any historians here, feel free to correct anything I'm saying in the comments if it's off. I say I'm an amateur, keen amateur historian, not a professional, so feel free to correct me. So the land base being destroyed, and it just becoming, you know, impossible to live there. Everyone starving to death. The implosion culturally, or this religious swing back, which can be really nasty. We're already seeing a slight conservative swing back, and you know, one historian I follow says we're sort of set up for a far right youth organisation right now, which I think is very worrying. I certainly don't want some kind of what's that feminist victim porn thing where the women all have red hats? I forget what it's called. So it's set in a world where a kind of conservative government is a fundamentalist Christian government has taken over America. I mean, that is a possibility if the liberal left keeps pushing this further and further and further into extremists, which is just not viable for most people. And I think that is a nasty possibility, just to be clear. There is, however, one more potential solution, or at least a delaying of the decay, which is renewal. And there's been various movements throughout various cultures to renew and strengthen a civilization. So if the good times create weakness, this is the key thing. So I am trained pretty thoroughly in Japanese martial arts. I spent 3 years of my life as a live-in student of Japanese martial arts, mostly in Western countries actually, but also a little bit in Japan. And several good friends of mine, I think in Matt Hill, Miles Kessler, have done this residential training. I've also done quite a lot of residential training in Asian Buddhist arts. So think of sort of the least decadent. It's not being sort of some uber disciplined far right person. It's actually being a Buddhist. It's actually being uprooting desire and craving and aggression. That'd be the least decadent. Sometimes I think of it like two wings of a bird, though. You know, we need the sort of liberal side and the conservative side, and decadence is when the liberal side kind of starts to run everything and take over culturally. Even if there are still some conservative institutions, like gradually they're moving more and more liberal. So we see, say, for example, even the Conservative Party in the UK is saying some very, very liberal things compared to, say, even 10, 20 years ago. Yeah. So, two wings of a bird. If you've ever seen a one-winged bird flapping around on the floor, it doesn't work very well. So don't think I'm making a case for the ultra-conservative. Actually, I'm making a case to say, hey, we should be really careful of the swing back, because whether it's the left or the right, either wing is not balanced in and of its own. So what's the solution? A renewal. What does that look like? So let's take the example of Japanese martial arts, which, as I said, I've gone into. And that's a praxis. So Greece never had this. It's not a very Western idea. An Eastern idea is that you have a physical practice to develop oneself. Specifically, to develop oneself through hardship. There are some Western equivalents to this. You'll see in the Orthodox Church, for example, some traditions. Maybe it was part of the British scholastic system, things like Outward Bound, in certain German traditions of health. Even sort of sports, which of course the English all invented, for anyone listening. Things like football and cricket and rugby, they were invented at places like Cambridge and Eton, and rugby is actually a British school. They were developed as character formation. And even when I was a kid, like running around in the cold on the field was considered character forming. I went to a state school that was sort of run like one of these kind of fee-paying schools. Gordonstone's kind of a classic that Prince Charles, King Charles, I should say, went to. So, yeah, there are traditions in the West that I think, things like scouts have kind of been watered down to a degree. They may be missing the point now. Sports, obviously, we don't look at a football star as sort of a symbol of moral virtue, whereas the Japanese really got this idea of Budo, martial way, where one developed oneself, but also one installed the culture. So in a Japanese school, all the kids will be asked to do kendo or judo. There's even sort of feminine equivalents in finishing school, like archery and things, or naginata, which is sort of considered the arts for young ladies. But they're pretty hardcore, and they teach discipline and they teach difficulty. Doing anything that's not easy deliberately is what makes you strong. So it could be fasting. That's got popular again. Notice that. Cold water and dowsing. That's got popular again. The old Wim Hof. Could be holding breath. Could be martial arts. Could be weight training. Like I see all these young men in the gym. You go to the gym now, it's full of like 16, 17-year-old lads in the UK. And I think other countries too. And what you're really seeing is young men knowing that they're weak and wanting to be strong, not just physically. If you talk to them, they talk about the discipline, they talk about going to failure and sort of mentally having to push oneself. That's what they really admire. That's why people like David Goggins are absolutely huge in the personal growth world for young men, is that they embody that, doing the difficult. They're sort of ex-Navy SEAL kind of guys, that kind of thing. So Jordan Peterson's also very popular because he has a conservative sort of ideology or philosophy, but he doesn't really have a praxis. So these young men, particularly young people in general, it's often young men that are the lead edge of the conservative turnback, by the way, for better and sometimes horrifically for worse, have reinvented this. They're looking towards praxis, looking towards challenging oneself to building strength, to do difficult things deliberately, which is wonderful. And that is really the antidote to weakness of decadence. We could say that service is an antidote to the narcissism. Purpose is the antidote to nihilism. So I've been a purpose coach for over 10 years now. Helped a lot of people with that, and mentor and coach and teach people on life purpose and how to find it, usually through the body, by the way. Like one reason I know this is my work is my body. I light up. I've got like 32 minutes have gone by and I haven't noticed it. It's just like I light up. I've got energy for it. So connecting to purpose rather than nihilism. I think even before that, though, it's just knowing that you're in a culture and being for it. Like I'm for the West. Again, it doesn't mean I think it's perfect. My family are Irish. I'm quite aware of colonialism and genocide and nasty things. However, if you really want to see those things, at their worst, then you could also look to the Mongols, the Aztecs, human sacrifices, all sorts of things. So the West is certainly not unique. People often say about the slavery in the West. Well, actually, the West was the first major culture in human history to end slavery. Yeah, the British particularly, than other cultures. I think it's the Danish that banned it first, and the British who sort of enforced it on the high seas at a lot of cost, materially, financially, and in lives of sailors. So there's something to be proud of there as well, right? So knowing you're in a culture, getting behind it, not in a sort of jingoistic, my culture right or wrong, but seeing that there's good in it, And I think what's really helped me in this is travel. I've spent time in Afghanistan. I've spent time in cultures I admire, like Ethiopia and Japan. I've spent time in cultures that I really don't want to emulate. I was in Dubai and just going, this is not the culture I want. I want less Dubai in my world, less totalitarianism, homophobia, sexism, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I'm actually pretty liberal. It might not sound it, but trust me, I am. And I don't want Dubai culture in the UK. I want as little of it as possible, actually. I don't support it. So what helps? Embodiment, coming back to the reality of the body. So one's not on a sort of abstract, identifying as an attack helicopter, lost in this sort of very theoretical, ideological kind of conversations. Service, as an antidote for narcissism, as an antidote to nihilism, as actually committing to a practice. I would say community as well, and some kind of getting back to the land, because that kind of land base, of the place you're indigenous to is really important, really important. Whether you're from an immigrant family like me, or your family have lived on the village for 1,000 years, it's really important. So I think that's part of it. So know you have a culture, find your life purpose through the body. Again, self-regulation through the body is so important, in that it helps us not be so hedonistic, right? Like I'm an addict, right? I get this. I've done this experiment with sex and drugs and rock and roll, and aside from the rock and roll, the other two didn't always end well. And, I had to learn moderation. I learned that, I went to Buddhist retreats, and I learned to sort of put aside my sex drive, to eat more moderately, to put aside technology. Renunciation is a very unsexy idea, but it's absolutely key to the Buddhist middle way. The middle way, by the way, would be considered pretty renunciate by modern standards, because we're in a decadent culture. I think there's Kali Yuga. They have a word for it, the sort of end of times, where it's very difficult to get enlightened because everybody's so screwed up, in Buddhist sort of cyclical ways of looking at things. So yeah, learning discipline through things like Buddhism, through things like weight training, having a philosophy, whether it's Stoicism, Buddhism, or whatever, Orthodox Christianity. There's various things I see people adopting. One of my colleagues became Orthodox. I've got a lot from the Dharma. I've got a lot from martial arts. There's things out there. Some of my friends love Stoicism. They really got into that. I've got a colleague that's really into the ancient Greeks. Well, actually realizing we have a culture, committing to it, developing a practice so you don't become weak. And I am weak many days. Okay, so sort of almost, again, it's a taboo word to be weak, right? And I can take the Gabon Mate thing and say, yeah, well, I'm self-medicating with sugar because, I have all this trauma. And there's truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that. We should cut ourselves some slack. But also, as well as being forgiving and empathic and cutting ourselves slack, maybe we should actually up our expectations. Maybe we should be dad as well as mum on this one, okay? Maybe we should say to ourselves, you know what? I could be better. And that can inform my choices in my sex life, in my work life, in my whether I train or not. Today I had a day off. I had a really nice balanced day off that didn't feel decadent. I woke up, had a sleeping because I've been tired. It's my first day off in a while. Meditated a little bit, not excessively, but just a little bit, because I know it's good for my mind. It makes me sort of less graspy all day. Went to the gym, had a nice sauna. I still enjoy life, right? But in the sauna, it's like cold water and hot, pushing my edge a little bit, relaxing, but also pushing myself. Both of those things are helpful to be strong, not just push. Had a nice lunch with a friend, went somewhere beautiful, this beautiful Gaudi building. Played around with some photography. We're doing a little bit of photography for work, but again, some work ethic, but simultaneously, it's a day off, so let's not go crazy. We're walking through the rain. We get caught in a rainstorm, right? Because there's always a rainstorm. Sometimes it's a rainstorm. Sometimes it's a really serious rainstorm, like the war in Ukraine, or, your dad getting cancer or something, right? You will get caught in a rainstorm sooner or later. And my friend is Ukrainian. I said, do you want my coat? We didn't have umbrellas. It was pretty rainy. She said, I'm not made of sugar, Mark. It's fine. And we just walked through the rain and found a cafe and, got some hot tea. And I was like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. That's a woman, So I don't think you have to be like macho. I was like, this is a strong woman. She's not just made of sugar, And I admire that. I admire that in a lot of my Ukrainian friends, for example, who are a bit less decadent in many ways than we are in Western Europe. Equally, here in Spain, and I've seen this in Portugal, I admire the community of people. I admire the wonderful community that I see around me. Here, with old people on benches who've known each other for years. Community is also an antidote to decadism, because it holds us accountable. If you're sort of holding wild murder sex orgies in a village, you pretty soon get found out. And people are like, hey, hang on a minute, you've been fucking my cat, what the fuck, So one, community is great for accountability, but B, it's also, it regulates us. We're co-regulatory animals. It's the isolation of the modern consumer condition. Just the record, I haven't ever had sex with a cat, in case someone thought that was a mad confession. But the co-regulation of communities, I think, is really, really key. For, again, not being so hedonistic, not having to have the drugs or the porn or the doom scrolling on Facebook or whatever. So there's my view on it. There are things I personally am doing. I'm actually starting, you know what? I don't want to go into the details. Watch this space. There's things to come that I think will personally be very, very helpful for people around this. And some of the benefits I've had, through martial arts and Buddhism and things like that, through being in Ukraine and having that cultural input. yeah, I hope to bring to a wider audience at a very reasonable rate and spread really as a movement. I see this happening anyway. Like the kids are okay. There's a lot of hope. The kids I see are pretty fucking cool. You speak to a 17-year-old in the gym, a lot of what I'm saying is absolutely obvious to them. Absolutely obvious. I'm seeing women reject the madness and, you know, really embrace a lot of strong traditional feminine roles without having to be like a submissive 1950s housewife. Don't worry. My colleague Alina, for example, is one I think of, kick-ass German woman, love her to bits, and she's inspired me a lot around a lot of this topic actually. And you know, we've been sort of talking and nodding together. She's been telling me about her husband, and we're chatting with him. And it's you know, women are absolutely a part of this turn. I think women are really sick of the bullshit, actually, is my listening. A lot of women just go, this is nonsense. And they're sick of the decadence. So, yeah, the kids are all right, women are all right, maybe men are going to toughen up a little bit. I think we can pull it back from the edge, or at least delay the inevitable, or make windows so the collapse doesn't happen everywhere. It's another solution that can happen is the main empire collapses, but there's people that go off and start afresh in Greek colonies elsewhere, or whatever it is. So I think there's hope. I hope that wasn't too depressing. And just try it on. Try it on, listen to my logic, read some history, see what you think. I'm developing this idea, so feedback definitely welcome. I hope there's something useful in there for you. Now back to the dolphin unicorn sex party.